pleasure to see everyone here. I see, well, we're a little bit past the hour, but I don't feel impelled to really say a tremendous amount. We've been through a lot. We just did a PhD orals exam that was very, very interesting. Zhongyan Yu just completed her PhD. So what I really would like to do is simply to summarize what I've been doing for the last couple of years. And of course, I should start out by expressing thanks to our researchers here at the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, who have played a key role in this whole process. I don't see Yoon Han right here. I think maybe Yoon is still working on something. She played a key role, and then many of our other researchers from the Reischauer Center. It takes me back to some issues empirically that I had a tremendous interest in when I was a kid. We never were really able to get access to China directly, but I lived along the periphery of China and beginning, I guess, visiting Shatin and the new territories when I was 8 years old, and living in Myanmar for 3.5, and also spending some time in Ethiopia and countries in the Middle East and so on. And so the whole question of the transformation of Eurasia, and in particular China's role in relationship to that, is something that I've had a deep interest in from long before really I became a Japan specialist. And that's what most of you probably know me as. I've spent 11 years in Japan, and Japan interests me tremendously, in the question of Japan's future. Really is something that I am always thinking about. But the question that I'm addressing here is the epic transformation that we have had since the collapse of the Soviet Union in particular, although you could go back to China's modernizations in the late 1970s for the beginning of the story. In fact, well, in some ways we can go right back across modern history, because this is a story of the rise of a new force, a major new force in international affairs that really began much more further back than the Belden Road. Before I get into that, though, I just did want to, I hope I have a good way to, let's see if I can move these. Oh, here we are. Probably have got the pointer that will take us into a proposition that really is prior to the story of this book, but an area of intellectual inquiry that I think has been sadly ignored for really since, I suppose, since the World War II. Most of the time since World War II, there are a few people that have influenced me that have been concerned about the role of geography in international affairs, or the study of geography, which unfortunately is one of the few major subjects in international relations disciplines that we really don't look at here at SAIS and almost at no other major universities. But the world really, despite Tom Friedman, is not exactly flat. It is flat, or something close to that, in many areas. Certainly in the financial realm, in important areas of connectivity and communications. The death of distance that Ed Glaser and, of course, Friedman builds on that. Many people have been talking about as an element of this. But that, to me, is exactly what makes geography such an interesting subject today. There are for certain reasons, geography inescapably is a reality of the global political economy that we can't avoid. For example, natural resources. Oil is located in a particular part of the world, and we can't avoid that. You know, railways connect different parts of the world. There are physical distances that may, in economic terms, psychological terms, be changing tremendously. But the world, we do have a physical geography to the world. So what makes geography particularly interesting to me right now is the way that it's being transformed by technology. The world, the physical world, and certainly the social world is profoundly different in a world of the internet from what it was before, even a decade ago. The world, and I'll go more into the question of logistics in a little further down the line, but the coming of the Internet of Things, certain aspects of artificial intelligence, combined with infrastructure, 5G is one aspect of that, begin to transform the world of geography in some very important ways. And those relate, I think, very interestingly to the issues that we see discussed and debated, but without a context, the more fundamental context of what their broader meaning is. I mean, we all talk about the Belden Road, for example, and about deepening conflict in AI and so on between China and the United States and this sort of thing. But the broader context, and I think the long-term meaning of a lot of those discussions really has escaped us. And some of that meaning is in the transformation of the meaning of geography. I've been particularly interested in this work in looking at continents. Not that continents are the only sort of aspect of geography that one might want to look at, but they are something analytically important. There was a time when in Western in Canada, for example, has dwelled a lot on the question of continents. The United States, the idea of manifest destiny, as we were thinking about the Golden Spike, as we were thinking about the Panama Canal. Well, the Panama Canal was more about connecting oceans, but the Golden Spike was about connecting the continent. A century and a half ago in this country, we did think quite a bit in terms of the concept of manifest destiny about continents, and that's where my book starts. The preface really deals with continentalism in American political thinking, which in an interesting way does parallel, in a haunting sort of way almost, some of the things that China has been saying recently about Belden Road. So, you know, what is in a world where distance is being transformed by technology, what difference does land matter strategically, psychologically, economically? That question interested me tremendously, and as I say, was really one of the impetus, the particular, put the edge on this sort of long-standing interest in the Silk Road and so on that I've had since I was a kid, and particularly Eurasia. I think we're just beginning, and I think the work of several people in this room, Dan Marquis among them, and Alicia Kempe, and several other people here I know are interested in the ways that the continent is being transformed and what is the political economy of a Eurasia, a new Eurasia that's emerging in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the growth of China. I think this is going to be an important, a tremendously important story going forward. I did in my previous book relating to this, The New Continentalism in 2012, I began to get into that. This isn't just a sequel. This book looks more at the global implications, particularly at the way that the death of distance and so on is beginning to transform the relationship of China and Europe in particular. I guess that's more at the heart of what I'm doing than anything. And of course, some of the meaning of that I think we can see even in Xi Jinping's recent visit to Europe and some of the new initiatives that he had with the port of Trieste and Genoa and things like that. But this story, of which our analysis I think is just beginning, is particularly interesting, of the transformation of continents due to technology and infrastructure with respect to Eurasia, especially if you're interested in the global implications, because as you can see here, continental Eurasia equals 40% of the world's land area, 70% of world output in purchasing power parity, 60% of global oil reserves, 80% of global gas reserves. Which brought me to this. Quite struck by something. I mean, Zbig Brzezinski, I think, has influenced many of us. We were privileged to have him here as a professor for many, many years. The faculty seminar that he did for around a decade is certainly something that influenced me. And he was conscious, very conscious of this reality that I'm going to begin to talk about. He said, as you can see, cumulatively, Eurasia's power vastly overshadows America. Now, what you mean by that, of course, is a debatable question. What constitutes, quote, power? But the basic tension that he drew, I think, is tremendously important to the future of international affairs. He said, fortunately for America, Eurasia is too big to be politically one. So that is the story that I would like to approach today as a political economic story. I'm not looking at mainly at the geopolitical chessboard, although I do think the changing relationship of China and Russia, even in the economic and infrastructural side, has major long-term global implications as well. But this is mainly a story about the transformation of global logistics and connectivity and changes in the financial world that leverage some of those changes in other areas. It isn't to say that there's a determinative path here. Of course, many of the there are considerable volatilities and moral hazards and all sorts of problems that we have begun to see in the discussion of debt. That said, I think we first of all ought to look at the map and the geo-economics of the world that's emerging. First of all, it's 30% shorter across the continent of Eurasia by land. As you can see here, I have Shanghai to Rotterdam, than it is around the periphery of the continent. Now, that doesn't mean that the choices are simply land versus sea. We're getting all kinds of hybrid arrangements. I think part of the logic that President Xi and that China has been presenting is, you know, a certain portion of sea and then going even to places like Trieste right here that he was discussing in his visit, you know, taking advantage of the economics of transportation by sea, but then also combining that in a hybrid fashion with various other logistics of land-sea transport combined. Now, so first, let me just go through the basic logic. It's 30% shorter across the continent than it is around the sea routes to the south. The two major areas that are, I think, coming into closer relationships with one another, particularly China and and Europe, especially Central Europe, are themselves in transition since the end of the Cold War. In the case of China, I think you can overstate this. I don't mean to say that, there's water, resource shortages, and so on. As far as China is concerned, though, particularly since President Xi's westward initiative of 1999, infrastructurally, certainly, China's infrastructure has become much more sophisticated, at least as far as Sichuan and so on, and also the north-south logistics in some ways are much more sophisticated. So the center of gravity of China's political economy has moved, I think, definitely in the last 15 years to the east, to the west. And the end of the Cold War and the rise of the relationships between Germany and the Visegrad nations, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and so on, has been moving the center of economic geography in Europe to the east. Now, I think we sometimes forget as well the centrality that China has on the Eurasian continent. Two-thirds of the distance from the Bohai Gulf to the Strait of Hormuz, as you can see, is inside China. Half of the distance from Shanghai to the border of the Schengen is inside China. So the things that China does, and I made this point in the new continentalism as well, that China does for its own reasons as domestic development have broader systemic continental implications that I think have not been considered sufficiently. And those, I would say really that Xi Jinping's, not Xi Jinping, Jiang Zemin's westward policies in the late 90s, of course, developing the relationships out to Xinjiang in particular, those began to develop the dynamics inside China that finally made the Belden Road a much easier proposition in geo-economic terms. Also, another thing, of course, is the energy relationships, and the logic of integration for Russia and for China both to the broader world, which creates, some attractiveness across the continent this way as well. Now, India, you might just say, we talk a lot, well, isn't there an India-China balance within Asia where India offsets China? As far as continental considerations are concerned, I think that's very difficult. And ironically enough, the key really is Iran, because Iran, of course, lies astride India's broader access routes to Europe across the continent. For China, it's a much more straightforward proposition across Kazakhstan and so on. Energy relationships, of course, are another important part of a potential deepening of relationships across Eurasia. Logistics. I go into this in a lot more detail in the book, and I guess the main point that I discovered, well, two or three things. First of all, the conventional route across the continent, of course, the Trans-Siberian Railway and so on, was really across Russia. And for Japan, or particularly for Korea, this still has a particular, there is a certain logic depending on where production facilities and supply chains and so on are. But the economic development of China and the beginnings of Belden Road, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, more importantly, opened the way for a whole set of other communications routes, which is important because I think there's a The role of Russia in the geopolitics of Eurasia has changed very significantly in the last 20 years, or since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this is one of the really important points that we have to take into account. The logistics revolution also, the emergence of hybrid transport. You know, you could partly by sea, say to Piraeus here, or to Trieste right here, and then by moving to rail, or across the Caspian, the possibilities of trans-Caspian communication or transport also has deepened, and transport via Turkey. So that, you know, the changing economics of the logistics and better border clearance and things like that is changing the transportation and economics across the Eurasian continent. So now, finance, it seems to me, really plays a key dimension of these changes that are underway. Of course, multilateral, as the Asian Development Bank has indicated, $30 trillion of investment needs in infrastructure in Eurasia, and, you know, by the year 2030 and so on. So in the end, clearly, there are major investment needs. There have been the traditional investment banks like Asian Development Bank, the EBRD, and so on. But what has happened recently that I think changes the geo-economics of and facilitates the emergence of new patterns across the continent, new infrastructural patterns, really is a whole series of Chinese initiatives. What, as we were just discussing on the way over, many of these fly in the face of initiatives that as recently as the Melbourne Summit. Just about 3 or so years ago, there were very different paradigms for G20 financial cooperation then have emerged. But there's a whole series of things, mostly funded by China, which have emerged since 2015. Some of them are pure, I think, really quite reasonably multilateral, and they have fairly sophisticated mechanisms for credit evaluation and so on. These vary a lot in terms of their transparency, in terms of the evaluation mechanisms. But just to mention them, and certainly one can come back, and there's a real specialist, or Zhonglan Liu is the person to go to, and I'm sure her book, when it comes out, this doesn't really rely on that, but I do know there's going to be a very good book in this area. But there's a whole series of institutions which have developed in China quite recently, which also facilitate this process of a connection across the continent. And I think at the micro level, it's also important to note all of the new institutions, many of them are national champions in China that have emerged. Costco, for example, on the seas, is now the third largest shipping firm in the world. And American shipping firms, you know, there's nothing really that is comparable. Costco has just 2-3 years ago, actually, in the Greek debt crisis, of course, purchased the port of Piraeus, role in Hambantota down in Sri Lanka. Again, when President Xi visited Italy, the prospect of new facilities, China-affiliated facilities in Trieste as well. So in shipping, China, on the distribution side, what I'm saying, we talk about the infrastructural side of Belden Road, and we attribute this to Belden Road, but really at the political economic level, the emergence of state-owned enterprises that are really quite powerful in the distribution area. It's important. Costco is one. The China Railway Corporation, that's in passenger service, by far the largest firm in the world. The China Railway Express freight services, which in freight are the largest in the world. and also, of course, very much affected by Internet of Things and some of the new revolutions in distribution technology. CRRC is the largest rolling stock manufacturer in the world by a considerable margin. Of course, in telecommunications, Huawei's role has been well remarked. And I discuss all of these in the book. Another one that is important, I would say, certainly in e-commerce, is the emergence of Alibaba, which has become a global player, in part through its important role in the finance of, a holistic approach to distribution that's not just selling a product, but includes the financing, like at the Alipay system, for example, is quite important. And I do get into these in detail, but I'm not arguing that this is, a mortal threat or anything like that. I'm basically just trying to describe the transformation and to say that we are in the midst of a transformation of geography and distance. That does mean that both infrastructure and also corporate ownership at the micro level becomes quite an important determinant of the future. Now, Southeast Asia, I think a lot of these relationships began to evolve most rapidly and are the most developed in terms of basically the nexus between Singapore and Chongqing. Well, Kunming. The railway that's underway, of course, is between Kunming and Singapore. And under Prime Minister Mahathir, of course, there's been issues raised about all of this and how rapidly will it progress. I think that's, certainly those issues are there. But important elements also are have been completed, the sections, most of it across Laos, for example. And also important infrastructural dimensions. For example, there's a major project between Singapore and China in Chongqing dealing with the Internet of Things. And that is important because Chongqing, of course, is a major rail center, it's a major road center, it's a major river, has the confluence of several rivers. And so, in terms of logistics, the ability to go from a railroad to a truck to the river and back and forth, and air, the transportation logistics become very important to the to the economics. And so that transformation, it seems to me, and the nexus between Chongqing and Southeast Asia is becoming, and will be in the future, important, because then westward, of course, you have deeper relationships to the rest of the continent. Russia. A lot of the book deals with Russia. And I think one of the most, in many dimensions, even including infrastructure or distribution. For example, Alibaba is becoming very active in Russia. But in energy, and there's just the broad theme is that the leverage between Russia and China has shifted very substantially over the past 15 years. Energy is one dimension. Of course, China has begun importing energy in large amounts from Kazakhstan, and also transit across Kazakhstan into Turkmenistan and so on. The energy linkages to the West are an important option, alternative to energy relationships with Russia. So the leverage and control that Russia has in energy, in logistics, is certainly been declining. Also, the economic shift is striking. At the beginning, what is that, about 1990 or so? Roughly speaking, the two economies were roughly the same size, and now China is maybe about 7 times the GDP of Russia, Russia's GDP is currently about the same as in nominal terms as the Republic of Korea, South Korea. So there's been a very big shift, and that isn't to gainsay the nuclear arsenal of Russia or anything else. It is to say that in many dimensions, China has much more leverage in relation to Russia than it used to have, which has broader global implications. Now, within Europe itself, of course, there are important changes. And these were born with the end of the Cold War. I'll never claim to be a European specialist, but it does seem to me that the changes within Europe itself are something that's of considerable importance for transcontinental relations that people really have not been looking at enough. This is the original six, the darkest, and then the expansions of the 1980s. Spain joined, Britain joined, Ireland, Greece joined. But these others are after the Cold War. Of course, Scandinavia is a bit of a special case, two neutral countries that felt they couldn't join until then. But these countries, former socialist states, mostly including, of course, three republics of the Soviet Union, had long historical ties with China. And through the 16+1 arrangement of annual dialogues and a lot of Belden Road initiative support, have been deepening their ties with China quite rapidly. The largest distribution center in the world now, and some of the areas outside, even here in Belarus, the largest distribution center in the world is now in Minsk, in Belarus, basically for the distribution of Chinese products to the 16+1 nations. So the deepening synergies across these countries, including also, of course, in the Balkans, the countries that haven't joined the European Union have particular synergies in relations with China. Now, to the theoretical side, which I think has a practical dimension as well. And this is an aspect that really, I think, has not been considered sufficiently. If you're talking about the implications of these transformations for global order, the key point that I would make is I don't think this system could be, or the recent developments in terms of infrastructure, in terms of relations between China and other nations, is subversive of the international order as we have traditionally conceived it. But it's not contradictory in the same very straightforward zero-sum way as many of the other challenges to the international system. It's based on a pattern of distributive benefits. Here I'm drawing on the work of Theodore Lowy, who made this basic distinction of rules-based systems, well-distributive and regulatory, the contrasts between a regulatory system such as that of Bretton Woods and a distributive regionalism and globalism such as implicit in the Belden Road initiative. It's not as rule-based, I think, arguably. I would like to see an argument that the Belden Road system is a rule-based system, or that something analogous, say, to Bretton Woods. To my mind, it's a little similar structurally to the sort of concert of powers in a certain, well, that had certain rules about intervention and so on, but it doesn't. The distinctive feature is that it really doesn't have a particular set of rules, and it's based on a distribution of resources, particularly the fact that China has so many resources through partly its sovereign wealth funds, partly, the relatively active lending to the world and so on. It has lots of resources to distribute. It's not exactly a tributary system either. And, you know, in the same way that the traditional Chinese world order, this isn't Changsha in the same sense as traditional Chinese tributary system. But it does have, you know, it does have a similarity in that it's not rules-based. Now, though that at least is the argument, and you might ask, just to summarize, what have I been arguing here? First of all, I think we should recognize again, we should begin to look at geography. And looking at geography, particularly, well, and I mean, generally across the world, that's one thing, but particularly in the case of Eurasia, we have to recognize that there's a new world geographically or geo-economically that's been born with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transformation of distance as a result of telecommunications and logistical advances, especially in the last decade. A lot of these things, and then the changes in international finance, in development finance that came about with the AIIB, and then the whole range of new institutions that China in particular, not only China, China's not the only one, but the changes in China's financial institutions have begun to create some broader catalytic changes in the international development finance structure. So the question that I'm asking, and in that this is a work in progress, much of this, of course, remains in the future as to where it will evolve. The weaknesses, the problems, the problem of moral hazard, the possibility of competition, mercantilist competition in world affairs. Those problems, I think, are out there. But to return again to the underlying economic geography of the continent, the distances are shorter across the continent by land than they are by sea. East Europe and Asia are moving closer. China is in the center. Russia and China are being reoriented. In India, by the nature of the geography, is marginalized. So what this means is the possibility of a new world of Asian geoeconomics emerging, which I won't say that it has an inevitability to it, but probably a stronger logic, I think, than much of the analysis that we've seen suggests. If you ask me, do I think that the Belden Road in the short run will succeed in its current form, I would say no. That it will, you know, there are many dangers that are being born. But do I think in the longer run that the world is being transformed? I do think that there is a strong possibility of that happening. So maybe I'll leave it at that. And then look forward for all of the flack. So please, thank you very much. So we, I don't want to take too long. There's a lot of all of this that certainly we can discuss. We do have a little reception afterwards for those who'd like to stay and to talk a bit, but maybe for a little bit of Q&A. Yeah. And if people could identify themselves also.
I'm Alicia Campy, working with the Reischauer Center, and basically my background is Mongolia and China, and I'm also exploring Eurasia. Kent, you are one of the preeminent specialists on Northeast Asia, and I like the map that you have, the continental drift map.
Yes.
And if we go back to this map, as a Northeast Asian specialist on Japan and the Koreas, where is Northeast Asia's future in this map?
That's an extremely good question. I wish that I had a broader map that also, of course, includes the oceans. And Japan, of course, being offshore, naturally has an easier path in terms of the maritime relationships. Uh, and I think one should note, even though there are marginal changes that are making, especially for inland areas, making the transportation economics far easier across land than previously was true. Still, the seas, the economics of transportation by sea, plus the commonalities of democratic systems and market economies and so on, I think give tremendous opportunity and scope for a country like Japan. Being a maritime nation, I think Japan is almost inevitably will be more wedded to the maritime world. But what I also think one should note that I think is not being noted in most of the analysis of U.S.-Japan relations, I think the emergence of these kind of deeper ties across the continent are creating a new complexity and a new dynamic that is going to make the Eurasian dimension more important for Japan. The fact, for example, Prime Minister Abe last October, when he visited China, he didn't say directly we're going to join the Belden Road, but he, was saying positive things about it. My guess is looking toward the G20 this year, probably you'll see some hedging, some not conceding to all of the essence of Belden Road, and there are important aspects that are not in Japan's interest, but some development of cooperative ties, healthcare, maybe some sort of dialogue over lending practices. I don't know. I wouldn't put this out of the range of possibility that there could be some cooperation. But fundamentally, I think for both Korea and Japan, the emergence of this kind of a continentalism is challenging. It gives China certain leverages and gives China certain attractiveness that is hard. Japan has to try to offset. Of course, India, in a way, as I said earlier, also is marginalized. So, but it also makes Southeast Asia quite critical, it seems to me, for Japan to deepen its ties with Vietnam, the offshore countries, the Philippines, and so on, I think, and Korea. The Southern strategy of President Moon Jae-in, I think, is along the same lines. This continental dimension means, Korea and Japan need to develop closer ties with Southeast Asia. Yeah, Gary.
I think the Achilles heel in all of this for the Chinese. The Achilles heel, sorry, I'm Gary Tellerico, I'm at SICE. For the Chinese in here is financial. So you mentioned, for example, all the resources that China is dedicating to this strategy, but it's all debt. The sovereign wealth fund is not sovereign wealth, it's debt. The only reason they have foreign exchange reserves is because they bought that foreign exchange from companies and issued debt in its place. So the resources of China in terms of the money that's being sent to develop all this is debt. And the debt trap has already emerged in Sri Lanka. There's been pushback in other countries. And, as Keynes very famously said, if you owe your banker £100, you need to listen to them, but once you owe them $1 million, you don't. The power shifts. So I just wonder about the financial flexibility over the long term that China is going to have. Their debt is already 300% of GDP, which equals that of developed countries, and they're still a developing country themselves.
I know we have somebody who does specialize in this. I don't know, Zhang Yuan, do you want to say anything about that? Or not?
Thank you very much, Professor Tallarico, and many thanks, Professor Calder. I I actually want to bring just go back to Professor Calder's earlier point, which is probably in the short run, we will see China do some recalibration for Belden Road, especially in terms of finance. But in the long run, I guess the broader geopolitical implication is we'll see a broader transformation in global system. But if we go back to China's capacity, I think Professor Calder and I do agree that there are limitations in terms of China's long-term capacity as well as the long-term sustainability. And I think Professor Tallarico and I also had the chance to and the honor to talk with Professor Tallarico recently in terms of China's sovereign wealth fund and how they are financed. And I guess what I wanted to see is that in addition to China's official foreign exchange reserves, there are also, there is no official accounting, but there are about, industry expert calculated that there are about 1.5 to 2 trillion dollars in terms of shadow foreign exchange reserves. They are shadow because they are held by a variety of other safe affiliated investment companies that are not counted towards foreign exchange reserves, but they are shadow in the sense that they are not counted towards the official reserves, but they are still foreign exchange reserves, mainly because the IMF definition of what do you mean by foreign exchange reserves. So I guess that's it.
Okay, thanks. I think this is a hugely important and empirical question, but you know, the savings rate, of course, in China is very high at the macro level. Certainly, major weaknesses in the domestic financial system. Certain, state corporations with major debt, banks that are in fragile condition, but the Huijin Fund, of course, it serves as a major shareholder in a lot of banks in China. And then issues like the shadow reserves, I think, do reduce the magnitude of the problem, of the debt problem. And of course, even to the extent that it is there, well, I don't think any of us will deny that there are major debt issues, and at the micro level particularly, a lot of the corporations involved, particularly because, if they're state guaranteed or they're state corporations, they have incentives to aggressively go out and to create indebtedness or to expand in ways that create moral hazard and so on, that ultimately would need to be covered by the state. Whether this in the short run is going to stop, I guess, China, my question is whether this will really stop. It may well modify the thrust of Chinese infrastructural expansion, but I don't think it will fundamentally stop it. And the geo-economics are such that if at any one point in time it slows down, for the future, those prospects will continue to exist. Yes?
Good evening. I'm Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington.
Is the mic on?
Sorry about that. You mentioned the Alibaba group, and those folks, they recently purchased the South China Morning Post, and the executive vice chairman, he said that it's significant because they produce a lot of content in English, and a lot of people around the world really want to know what's going on in China in a language that they can more easily understand as opposed to Mandarin. And And I was wondering if you could speak on the importance of the acquisition of the Alibaba group to the South China Morning Post. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting development, and media is another important dimension, I think, of the global transformation that is going on, and the ability to shape media opinion and especially in a strategic location like Hong Kong, I think that's important. In the case of Alibaba, we have to remember, of course, that it is basically a private corporation. Of course, it does have some close government ties and certain unambiguous characteristics in terms of corporate governance that make it vulnerable, I think, to government's suasion. But that said, it's not a state corporation in the same sense as, say, Costco. So I don't, and there are probably commercial dimensions to this too. I haven't looked really. We didn't research that in detail. I don't know if anyone else had some thoughts on that question of the South China Morning Post acquisition as to what it involves. I guess I don't see it as necessarily anything particularly sinister in its character. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not a specialist in that. I don't know if anyone would like to add anything. Okay. Maybe, yes, Dan.
So, is this on? Yeah? Okay. I'm Dan Marquis here at SAIS. So I look forward to reading the book, but I wanted you to sort of take us back to the Brzezinski quote and kind of reflect on that a bit more. You've just said in your kind of answers to questions that countries like Japan or India, perhaps Korea, should be somewhat concerned about the implications of this overland.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. This overland integration, because it prioritizes or privileges Chinese influence in certain ways and plays to China's strengths in ways that they don't have. But what do you make of this? I mean, are we really in the near future seeing the type of integration that should make Americans quite nervous? And if so, what ought we to do about it? Because it's not just the Americans in this story who are going to be worried. Presumably the Japanese, the Koreans, the Indians, and perhaps some Southeast Asians as well. So and do you comment on this in the book, or is this beyond the scope of this particular
the last
exercise? Chapter
has to do with policy. Yes, and particularly American policy. I don't think, I'm trying to avoid really a scare tactics or anything like that. I do think that there potentially could be I do think there's a fundamental shift in world affairs that's underway. And I think the significance of Belden Road, the forces behind it, which are larger than Belden Road, and some of them are rooted simply in the geo-economics of the continent, are more substantial. I mean, in the long run, the United States has such creativity technologically. It has the strength, the converse of China's strengths. China has huge population. China has a central location. But of course, that conversely creates certain kinds of vulnerabilities that the United States, with two oceans on either side, doesn't. Got a huge population. It means someday, not too far in the future, it will have most likely the largest GDP in the world. But it will also have the largest food requirement for food and for energy. It already is the largest energy consumer in the world. In PPP terms, it already is the largest economy. So, it has those vulnerabilities. It has the vulnerabilities of its, quote, strengths. And So I think that gives certain converse capabilities to the United States, plus the globalism of American policy, the diversity, the range of global contacts that the United States has, the role in the global financial system. I think the appeal globally, and for that matter to China, of a global system that operates in a holistic sort of way. You know, Bob Zalek years ago was talking about the idea of China as a stakeholder. And I think the logic for China must be also is quite substantial. But China has too these underlying geo-economic, to my mind, strengths in terms of if it's strong, its centrality is a tremendous plus for China, I think. If China is weak, its centrality, just as we saw throughout most of the 20th century, is a tremendous sense of vulnerability and weakness. And so, so what does this mean for policy? Well, I think it means probably that the challenge of a changing world is more substantial than we give it credit for. That it may well be more enduring, I think, than most Americans tend to feel. It's going to have to involve, and I mean, I don't see how I could ever really be a supporter, but I do think some aspects of recent policy, you know, of take a forthright kind of policy on intellectual property and on trade relationships and so on, given the sort of world that we're moving toward, is probably necessary for the United States. Because I think the nature of the transformation and the challenge is greater than we generally, I think, than most people see. Now, some part, and I do talk about this in the book, an Indo-Pacific strategy that I think is more coherent than what we have now, is some part of this. But India, as I was saying, you know, as I say in the book, India, in terms of this supercontinent that's emerging, is structurally disadvantaged. And again, the irony, I don't want to get into that issue, I'm just pointing it out. I think the irony that the obstacle to India's deeper relationships with Europe and with the continent itself is really Iran. The fact that its access routes really are across Iran is one aspect of that. So I think relations with India are important, and in a global world, of course, they're strong in software, and connectivity makes things easier. They're a maritime nation. You know, all of those things, Japan, India, Australia, the Quad, you know, the Quad does, I think, have some logic. But also, we're going to have to come to terms more systematically, I think, with the evolution of continentalism. Japan's a piece of this. I'm delighted to see Prime Minister Abe visiting Europe more, including the nations of Central and Eastern Europe. The locus of gravity in Europe has shifted to the east, to the center and to the east. And so the 16 plus one nations, Germany, you know, South Asia, for that matter, the southern part, Greece. We thought of the Greek financial crisis as a matter of Europe, of just the Atlantic. But of course, that is when it was amidst that crisis, and in economic terms, it was good that, you know, that's when China, Costco acquired the port of Piraeus. So, you know, thinking more globally, thinking, you know, should the U.S. be involved with the BRI? I think probably I mean, we should continue to criticize lack of transparency, debt bombs, you know, and the kind of things happening in Hambantota. I think even the Xi administration sees some of those excesses too, and I tend to see those as a lot of them at the micro level. You know, these are companies that are being assured by the government of they don't have to worry about their debt, and so they just go ahead and make irresponsible loans, or maybe they're not used to dealing in international markets. So it's not simply, I think, one big conspiracy. A lot of it is lack of experience in international activities, and so from that sort of way, I can't help thinking, is there any dimension, Japan has begun to do this, is there any dimension in which the U.S. needs to think a little more, well, to get a little distance from sort of the emotional or the geopolitical aspects of Belden Road? Not to say that the United States should join BRI. I'm not sure that there's a particular point in that. But AIIB, cooperation between AIIB and some of the international institutions, it's already happening. And then looking for more transparency, and if there is more transparency, are there new ways to cooperate with China to push it in the direction, you know, that's more the stakeholder notion that Zelick was talking about, instead of, you know, it's a conflict and cooperation dimension, I think, as so much of our relations with China are. But it has to be conscious, I think, of a reality that has more substance to it than it's usually given credit for. Okay, somebody maybe who hasn't asked, do we have maybe somebody in the back, and then we'll come back? Yep.
I would like to, yeah, my name is Steve Miller, and I just ended a long career at the State Department in international transportation policy. And I'd just like to ask a question about the logistical links across Eurasia, because a single container ship can carry about 18,000 containers, whereas a container train can maybe carry 500 containers. And also, a lot of the cargo that moves between Europe and Asia is not time sensitive. It is much more sensitive to the regularity of delivery, which might be a problem across a lot of these unstable political areas. I was just wondering if you've given consideration to that.
Yes, I do deal, and I think those are certainly important issues. I think there's been important changes in the last decade, or even the last 2 or 3 years, that a lot of people don't appreciate. As you know, the first of those transcontinental trains from Duisburg over to Chongqing and further to the east coast of China began about 2011. The numbers have been expanding quite rapidly. Still, a lot of it is subsidized. I think that's a fair point. But first of all, border clearance with electronic commerce and electronic border clearance procedures, and in places, for example, like Kazakhstan, I think there have been important developments. The European Union actually has aided in a lot of this. In some ways, even the Eurasian Economic Community, ironically enough, the including the Russians, wanted to see more commerce among Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, and so on. But what this is doing has been turning Russia into more of a transit area. So I think on the political, in terms of border clearance, there have been important changes. Like you suggest, the transport that's not so time sensitive, this is really the area where there's been big changes. In PCs, for example, Chongqing is now by a substantial margin the largest producer of personal computers in the world. And that, in the last 15 years, has expanded very rapidly. And that is that kind of thing, or the, components coming eastward from Europe. It's things like food products and quality, safe food products and that kind of thing. And going westward, particularly manufacturing projects from central China, those kind of things. The automobile industry is getting a lot more integration in terms of supply chains. There's been an important change in relations between Europe and China in the last decade. Also technological cooperation. For example, in electric vehicles, BYD, the battery cooperation between China and Germany, for example. Manufacturing is the area where this is advanced the most rapidly. And I think e-commerce, just to add one final point, I think e-commerce and sort of 3D manufacturing and many of the technical changes on the distribution and manufacturing side are making supply chains across the continent easier. And I guess really the other important point is that for the United States, it's the converse of what I said earlier. I think is important for the United States to be conscious of the challenge that China presents. But the difficulty is that the evolution of these ties across the continent with Europe, which are becoming easier, also are giving China leverage that it hasn't had as much before with the U.S. So it's a work in progress, to summarize. But I think we have to recognize that there's been important changes in production chains and the economics of production chains across the continent in the last few years. Yoon, did you have a question or you make a comment? Oh, Jeb.
Thank you for noticing me all the way in the back, Dean Calder. Jeb Benkowski. I'm a PhD student here at SAIS. I'm struck by China's, I think you've rightly pointed out that this isn't a strictly Chinese vision of Eurasian integration. It's a long-standing one. But I'm struck by this transcontinental vision of integration juxtaposed against increasing regional fragmentation in sort of large parts of this continent, which makes me wonder, what are sort of the leading risks that you see to this vision over the next decades?
That's a really, really good question. Maybe I should preface that by saying the world that we have emerging is not the world of Bill Emmett. I mean, he's an old friend. I've known him a long time. Maybe a lot of you know from The Economist. But I don't think, he wrote a book called Rivals a few years ago, which was basically arguing that, the great game is reviving in Eurasia. And I think that is really simplistic in some ways. No doubt, in a geopolitical, political military sense, there are rivalries between China and India, inevitably, both nuclear powers, and that sort of thing is there. So that's one. You say, what are the risks to this kind of a vision? One is sort of the great power politics of Asia, that Japan-China rivalries will deepen, or that China-India rivalries will deepen, and that we'll get the great game of the 19th century coming back again. Well, I think the political economy, the connectivity that's emerging across the continent is dampening those prospects. There's over $100 billion of trade going on between India and China now. And those, that is one. If there's one area where geopolitical rivalry will rear its head, I think that's probably one of the greatest possibilities. They're not linked. Even geo-economically, as we were saying, India doesn't have a good route across the continent to Europe of its own. Its routes to the world really are by sea, which is a very different dynamic than China has. So there's some underlying rivalry, but there's also a deepening bilateral relationship with each other, and even some joint ventures and so on. Another sort of risk, well, maybe I should say a word about Sino-Japanese relations. A lot of people in Tokyo, friends in Tokyo, use the word Koharu Byuri, which means the Indian summer, in terms of the recent developments between the two. You know, Abe's visit to Beijing, and Xi Jinping's going to visit, and well, okay, it's fine now, but this rivalry will deepen. Well, that's not unimportant either as one potential risk. But there is going to be a gravitational pull of the continent. I do think if a lot of at least of the logic that we have here, there'll be a gravitational pull of the continent that is going to probably would dampen those rivalries, I suppose. The other big one that I would think is the dangers of the moral hazard and the bad debts and the micro level problems that are emerging. You know, I mean, all these state corporations that China has that are right in the middle of this, and they're going ahead and they're quite aggressively going out and lending to people, as we've seen, like Hanban Toda and all of that. You know, will this create financial crises? We've seen some of this in Malaysia, Pakistan, Maldives. You know, those kind of consequences of this, I think, are also substantial. Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Hi, Steve Winters, independent consultant and actually Hopkins alumnus. So a number of weeks ago, Graham Allison spoke here in DC, and he said that last December he was over in Beijing for maybe 10 days and talking to one of the very top personal advisors to Xi Jinping, who told him, he said, Graham, about a year ago, we still had some doubts here in Beijing about your Thucydides trap and your thesis about inevitable conflict between the declining power and the rising power. He said, however, now, this was last December, we are totally on board with you. We are convinced this is what's happening. This is the problem. We're all
this being what?
Thucydides trap, that there will be a strong potential of a war between China and the U.S. over the rising power, declining power. And so he said, what we think should be done is that the U.S. and China should get together and really put our heads together and see how we can avoid this inevitability, which they've at least bought into. So I was just wondering, from our side, do you go along with that, or do you think we should be thinking along those lines?
You can see sort of it's implicit in what I was arguing here. Let's see if I can get it back again. Oh, sorry, it's right at that last chart. I think we need to remember what the basic nature of this challenge is. It's not sort of a great game in the 19th century sense of the term. It's not this kind of a change. Either, okay, we don't like Bretton Woods, we're going to set up another system. We're going to exceed the United States as we're going to become a global hegemon or something like that. That is, I think, the basic problem with the Thucydides trap argument. It misspecifies the nature of the challenge. What I think, at least what China is trying to do, maybe is to leverage its geopolitical centrality by distributing resources in a way that will strengthen its underlying geopolitical position, but not challenge the U.S. directly. I don't think China really has the intention of challenging the U.S., the underlying structure of the regulatory system, for example. Maybe this kind of thing, well, this was sort of what Kissinger himself was thinking of as a design for the international system, 15 years ago. Well, no, time has passed, 40 years ago. Faster than I thought. Become a major sort of a stakeholder in the system. But I don't think it's trying to replace, and that even could be consistent, at least with the form of this. I mean, it's not trying to, at Belden Road Forum, I was at the first one, I wasn't at this one, but Christine Lagarde spoke, Jim Kim spoke, the head of the WTO. They were very prominent in the front of all of that. So I think China intends to stay within the basic structure of the system. And to say that this is a zero-sum relationship between the two assumes that China is trying to create a totally different system or something like that. And I just don't think that's what they intend. Or that that's what will happen. Oh, okay, maybe one, go there and then back to Professor Tallarico.
Thank you, Professor. I'm a final year science student. So in your lecture, I see that China is probably the major driver of the continental integration. So I'm wondering, beyond China, do you see any global power or regional power that has intention or interest to promote the integration? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because in the book, one thing that I stress a lot, and this is the difference from the old sort of great game type of analysis of Eurasia. I think the middle powers, what have I done? Well, you can probably see this. I can show you. I mean, of course, Kazakhstan right here. Mongolia right here. Recently, of course, Uzbekistan has come to a more dynamic role in the system. Turkey, Erdogan has big plans for Turkey's role. Within Europe, several of the players in the 16+1, maybe 16+1 as an entity. Of course, Japan has been involved in various ways. The Koreans are involved. I think Russia's role is declining, but Russia used to sort of prevent the Soviet Union. In the days of the Soviet Union, you didn't have much direct relation between Europe and Northeast Asia because the Soviet Union stood between. And it's not true now. And you have all of these countries, as I said, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Uzbekistan, the 16+1, even the Belarus, in various ways. There's a whole bunch of sort of middle powers that are sensing the emergence of a new Eurasia. And so they're mediating this. If you look, say, at European integration, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying this is analogous to the European Union or something like that. But in Europe's emergence, the Benelux, the smaller, the Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, they played quite an important role in regionalism. Or take in Mercosur, take the role of Uruguay. A lot of times, the smaller countries, medium countries, can play quite an important role. And so I do think that that's true, and that's one of the reasons I think this whole process might have more momentum, because it's not just China. Yes, Gary.
So I just want to go back.
Which one?
The last one with the rules-based thing. So I kind of agree with you that I think China's long-term objectives here are not as possibly sinister as people think. 60% of trade within, in 60% of trade in Asia is now within Asia. And that's likely to be duplicated with this extension of what China is doing, depending on what those countries can really add to the global supply chain. But at the end of the day, isn't the answer from the United States to this, quote, challenge, whatever it might be, is all about rules? I mean, the biggest problem we have with China is that they don't play by the same rules in trade. And so TPP was meant to be a geo-economic answer to China, which kept them out and said, okay, you want to be part of this, you got to play by the rules. We're trying to do that on a bilateral basis now, and I don't know how successful it'll be. But isn't that, at the end of the day, more of what we're concerned about than anything else? That China played by rules that make this global liberal economic order work, and not try to game the system as they often do in various ways.
Well, I agree with you. That is to the extent that the United States is a globalist power. And some of what we've been doing itself has been denying recently the notion of universal rules. But to the extent that the U.S. is a global power that isn't just parochially seeking its own interests, rules and a transparency, I think, do represent American interests. I tend to agree with you on that. But relating that to the issue that we have before us here, I'm skeptical that we have the leverage to enforce that. And I think you're going to see that in the trade agreement, probably, that almost certainly will come about, fairly soon between the U.S. and China. Already on, some of the issues that supposedly on the, the major systemic, the regulatory side of the U.S. China trade agenda, it looks like there'll be some backsliding, some modification, however you want to put it. That's the question to me. Maybe as China becomes a stakeholder, it already is an important stakeholder, more of a stakeholder in an open system, then I think there would be stronger incentives of that way. At present, China has a lot of leverage just on this side because it has the resources. It has the ability to introduce new telecommunications systems. Is the United States willing to match the kind of money that China is putting out in areas like that? Or is Japan, or do they have the resources to do that? So, at least in the short run, the question to me is whether really, we have the resources to enforce a regulatory type of system. I think it's probably in most respects in our interests if we were consistent in ourselves in applying it. But this is probably more than anything, I think, a question both of resources and geoeconomics. That the way that the continent is developing is, maximizes the advantages of being in the center. And a country that has the resources to maximize the advantage of being in the center is likely to use them. Although at the same time it will probably also it will speak to some degree to global concerns, but it might very well focus on what's more narrowly in its own interests. Very interesting and important question. I see that we're I'm more than happy to discuss a few other things we have some refreshments in the other room if people would like to stay and continue. But thanks very much. I appreciate all the feedback.